Hey nature photographers, it's Lee Hoy, and I'm excited to share this video with you today because it's the first video that is a direct result of a comment from the last video. So y'all need to give a good shout out to my YouTube subscriber, Mr. 360, and let me read to you his comment from the video on subconscious intentionality. Now, one thing I think that is ironic, I knew doing that video my views and my income would drop. Sure enough, would you believe it dropped 50 bucks for the month? Again, it blows me away that videos on equipment are all that do really well when I feel like that's one of my most powerful videos. And OM System subscriber, Eric Rock, also gave me, I think, one of the best compliments I've had in a long time, and he is a great-hearted dude as well. If you ever get a chance to go on a workshop with Eric and you're an OM System user, do, because you will not meet a more genuine, like, he's so nice it makes me sick. You know, he is a great guy. He's like a dear friend, like a brother to me, really. Very good man. But let me read to you Mr. 360's comment. He said, "Great video as always, Lee's. Thank you for the heads up. May I ask you something on your setup? How have you got your OM1 set up for each of the three values, shutter speed, aperture, and ISO? As the OM1 has two dials, it interests me how others attain the third function that can't be on a dial. There are many ways to achieve this with the OM1. Well, it triggered my mindset, not just about what he asked, but even bigger. So what I'm going to share with you today is how I have shutter speed, aperture, and ISO set on each of my cameras, okay? And the default exposure settings for all the different custom modes that I utilize on my OM1 and my OM1 Mark IIs. This is going to be very valuable information, so stick around. Right after the intro, we're going to get into it. Howdy from West Texas. I'm Lee Hoy, professional nature photographer, and this is my YouTube channel, Lee Hoy Photography. I'm an OM System ambassador, photography workshop instructor for Wildside Nature Tours of Precision Camera and Video, and contributing author for the Journal of Wildlife Photography. Well, what settings do I use first to control my shutter speed, aperture, and ISO on the OM1 and the OM1 Mark II? Here's how I have my cameras laid out. And I've said some of this before in other videos, but I think it'll be good to have a comprehensive video on this topic. Because I do back button focus, I move shutter speed to the front dial. That way, I don't have to let go of focus to adjust the shutter speed on the back dial. So when I'm making adjustments for wildlife, which is where speed and accuracy are of the utmost importance, I don't want to have to pull my thumb off the back button focus to make shutter speed adjustments, because that is the primary adjustment I make in the middle of shooting. That's an important distinction. The primary adjustment I make in the middle of shooting wildlife is shutter speed. I will occasionally adjust aperture based on my desired depth of field, and if the light is changing, I may adjust ISO. So the subjects I adjust the most are shutter speed, then ISO, then aperture for all modes of photography, but more so for wildlife in the moment. So shutter speed is going to be a quick adjustment, particularly because I can see my live highlight alerts and make adjustments accordingly, okay? Aperture, that depth of field, is generally remaining fairly constant for all kinds of photography modes. And ISO is going to adjust as light changes. So depending upon the conditions, if you're shooting in a lot of great light, you're probably not having to make constant adjustments to the ISO unless you're hiking, riding in a car, whatever. And even then, you can still set yourself up for success by focusing on specific lighting conditions that will produce the most visually compelling images. Now, all of my different camera bodies, in between 3 OM1 Mark IIs and 2 OM1s, I can program. Let's see, I'm not the sharpest math guy, but if I have 5 camera bodies and 4 custom modes, that's 20 custom modes, okay? But let's talk about when you turn on your camera, there are exposure settings that are going to pop up every single time in a custom mode. If you're in manual mode aperture, it's going to be whatever you last used. which is dangerous. If you just use manual mode and you want to go from night sky to wildlife to landscape, you're often going to miss shots because you're probably not prepared as you should be. Custom modes alleviate that problem. So let's talk about wildlife. Now, when I'm talking about wildlife and I program a custom mode, that custom mode is dedicated to mammals, birds, and birds in flight. I know some people program different custom modes for mammals, birds in flight. For me, and in my opinion, that's a complete waste. I don't need to have a custom mode be used just for pro capture when I can change drive modes very quickly. That is a waste for me, okay? For me. Now, if all you shoot is wildlife and nothing else, may not be that big a deal, but for me, that would be a waste of custom mode. So mammals, birds, and birds in flight, because I programmed the exposure compensation button to subject detection, turning it on and off. I can hold that down, spin the rear dial, and bam, adjust for mammals. So here are my default exposure settings when I turn on my camera in wildlife custom mode. And on my wildlife body, that is always gripped. I always have a grip. It brings better balance to the 150 to 400 when it's on that, okay? Here are my default settings, exposure settings, whenever I turn it on. Shutter speed, 1/2500th of a second. Aperture is f5.6. Now, obviously, if you have the 100 to 400 or you have other lenses that can't get that fast an aperture, well, you may need to be at 6.3, 7.1, but I have the 150 to 400, and I'm going to put it at 5.6 when I turn my camera on. ISO, 1600. So those are the three default settings when I turn on my camera or move to custom one. That's where I start. I don't want to have to make a huge adjustment for ISO 1600. If your default ISO for wildlife is 200 or 400, you're probably underexposing a lot of images, shooting in a crappy light a lot, or really pushing it. I mean, I don't remember the last time I shot wildlife at ISO 400. You know, occasionally you'll have enough light. And yes, I can drop my shutter speed, but I want to be prepared for bird in flight, mammal action. So I don't really care about pushing my shutter speed real low, even though I know I can for perch birds or mammals that are being still. Yes, I will do it at times, but that's not my priority. All right, so let's talk about a custom mode for landscape photography using a tripod. Okay, landscape photography with a tripod, your default exposure settings should be different than handheld. Default landscape mode on a tripod, my shutter speed will be 1/100th of a second. It's normally going to go slower than that, but that's where I start. F16 at ISO 200, that is the native resolution. That's going to be your best bet. And if I'm on a tripod, slower shutter speeds are generally going to be what I want to do. So landscape mode, tripod, those are my exposure settings. Let's talk about landscape mode handheld. Now we're generally using wider lenses, okay? If I were going to grab my 40 to 150 f2.8 for long lens landscape, I may make some adjustments to this, but in general, my default exposure settings for a landscape mode handheld is going to be 1/200th of a second, f16, ISO 400. Now, this is important to understand. I push my shutter speed to handheld landscape lower, no doubt. I have done as slow as 2.5 seconds handheld and got attack sharp images. But, you know, that's a rare occasion when I was in a canyon with a waterfall where you couldn't use a tripod. That's not what we want to be doing regularly and consistently. Yes, we can, but it doesn't mean we should all the time. Now, let's talk about the next mode. Macro mode for insects, reptiles, and amphibians. I rarely do flowers only. People that do macro for coins or jewelry, this is going to be different, but I'm a nature photographer. I'm talking about insects, reptiles, and amphibians primarily here. And these settings apply to the lenses, the 30 millimeter, the 60 millimeter, or the 90 millimeter macro, okay? So with the trinity of macro lenses that OM System has, these are my default exposure settings when I turn my camera on or move into that custom mode. Shutter speed is going to be 1/100th because that is I'm sorry, I should have added using flash. So let me say this again to make it clear. Macro mode for insects, reptiles, and amphibians with flash using 30 millimeter, 60 millimeter, 90 millimeter OM system macro lenses. 1/100th of a second. Why? Flash sync speed for silent drive mode. f14 at ISO 400. Now I can often adjust my ISO, but ISO 400 is where I want to start. That is a good base starting point with exposure, regardless of light. If I'm doing macro, I will often create shade using my body on my subject so that my flash helps to bring out even more and there's no blown out highlights, or at least try not to, right? Okay. Now, macro mode for insect, reptiles, and amphibians without flash using the 3 macro lenses. Still 1/100th of a second because these lenses are so light, so short, but f8 at ISO 400. Going to give myself a little more light with the aperture. May use focus stacking to make up for the lack of flash, right? So, and lack of depth of field accordingly. Those are going to be different. And I use flash a ton in macro. I like bringing out color. I like filling out details. I like dark backgrounds sometimes. So I love flash with macro. It's just been my thing. I will do non-flash macro at times, but I'm often using a light. I really, honestly, I could do macro 50% more than I get the chance to. Honestly, you will see more macro OM system workshops from me. I'm going scouting on the Osa Peninsula in Costa Rica coming up later in September. Going there for my birthday, and I'm going to scout for a location where it will be a macro only workshop, and the destination is now a partner with OM System. So be watching for a really cool workshop there. Well, dragonflies, damselflies, and large insects, reptiles, and amphibians with a long focal length lens, with a super telephoto lens, okay? What are my exposure settings? I talked about this some in my recent video on photographing dragonflies and damselflies. I'm sorry, photographing dragonflies, which you can watch here. Look at there, I'm learning some YouTube tricks. And here are my settings. 1/1600th of a second at f8, ISO 1600. I'm using a longer lens. I want a faster shutter speed. Can I go slower? Absolutely. But I find most people, and many of us are older, really get too slow on the shutter speed and end up with blurry shots. So if I'm shooting a rattlesnake, you know, I want more mobility. I'm not going to be on a tripod. I'm down low. I'm going to have a little shallower depth of field, so I have a faster shutter speed to maybe freeze a tongue coming out, a rattle. Sometimes I like the rattle to be blurry, and I'll adjust shutter speed accordingly. But again, this is where it is when I turn it on. I believe we're on number 7, is night sky single image. I'm shooting a single image. No stacking of images, no star tracker, but a single image, night sky. And with DxO Pure Raw 4 now, single images can be phenomenal. I did several the other night during a precision camera night sky workshop right here around Fort Davis and Marfa. So here are my, and now of course you need to understand your shutter speed will often be dependent upon your focal length. Use a phenomenal app like Photo Pills to calculate that. And I tend to go somewhere between the 1/500 rule and the NSF rule. This video is not about that. We'll talk about that more another time. So, but when I turn my camera on or move to that default mode, my shutter speed starts at 15 seconds, not 1/15th, 15 seconds, f2.8, because I'm often using the 7-14, the 12-40. I will use the 8 1.8, and I might stop down to f2.0 or the 12 2.0, which I'll be at 2.0, but f2.8 when I turn it on at ISO 5000. And you can get nice, clean, sharp shots of the Milky Way with the OM system at ISO 5000. Ignore the haters. They've never even tried. And if they have, then they probably didn't know jack crap about post-processing or how to expose it correctly. So don't listen to the morons who've never tried but tell you can't. That's my favorite group of people in the world. Night sky stacking Milky Way shots. So if I want to stack, you know, shoot 10 to 17 night sky shots, stack the images use 7 dark frames, that process. This video is not about that, so don't ask about that. I'm not going to go into detail yet. That's another video. But again, shutter speed is going to be focal length dependent, but I'm still going to start at 15 seconds, f2.8, ISO 3200. Okay? These are my settings. I always leave shutter speed on the front. I always leave aperture on the rear dial, and ISO is the button in the rear dial. I tried for a short while swapping ISO and aperture, and I just didn't like it. It didn't work as well for me. And in that case, I don't like it. My mind, going right for shutter speed is a faster shutter speed, reducing light. Going right on a dial for aperture is stopping down, reducing light. That is how I have my OM1 and my OM1 Mark IIs set up. Hope you've enjoyed this video. Hey guys, if you really love a video, share it for me. I already told you I lose views and I lose income doing the videos that I think are the most important, because I won't talk about equipment every single time. I'm not going to sell out just for the money or the views. But if you enjoy them, help me out. Help a brother out. I'm not going to, you know me, I don't beg for mashing that stupid subscribe or like button. I have no problem with YouTubers who do, but this is me, and I appreciate your help. Your comments, thanks for letting me know when you've learned and it's successful. Join me on OM System Workshop. I'm going to start up a second OM System mentorship program. Check it out, guys. Y'all have a good one. Bye-bye.